All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Cox. I am the diversity chairperson for the Council for Exceptional Children's Division of Autism and Developmental Disabilities. And thank you for joining us for today's community chat, partnering with families to support caregiver mediated intervention. I am joined by Dr. Mandy Rispoli. She is going to do a brief introduction of herself and then share her brilliance with us about working with families. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Hi, good evening. I'm Mandy Rispoli. I'm a professor of special education at the University of Virginia. And most of my work focuses on supporting caregivers and teachers to implement evidence-based practices with children with autism. And I'm really excited to be here and to engage with everyone tonight. So I think we can start by talking a little bit about the important role that caregivers have in child development. So typically developing children and their caregivers often create natural learning opportunities with ease. They require little, if any, external assistance. But children with autism often require explicit instruction in order to develop some of their social interaction skills or communication skills. And such intentional or explicit instruction might not already be in caregivers or parents' skill sets. And so when caregivers want to be able to support their child's development, they often need specialized instruction and coaching to implement those interventions. And when a caregiver is implementing an intervention, it's called caregiver mediated intervention. And caregiver implemented interventions or mediated interventions are typically non-intensive instruction that's implemented within everyday routines. And the idea is just to continue to boost and support communication and any other outcomes that are important to the family. But we know that training in caregiver mediated intervention is not equitable. So families in rural areas or families without access to other training resources are less likely to get access to those supports. So finding ways to give all families the opportunity to learn about interventions and implement interventions with their child is really important. Additionally, there are several barriers that may impact child learning. So these include challenges with carryover of learned skills or behaviors from one environment or context or use of those behaviors with certain people to new environments or new contexts or new people. And we call that generalization, where the child can take a skill learned in one setting and use it in a different context. And we know that this is a challenge for kids with autism as well. And so, for example, a child might learn a skill at school or in therapy and then not use that behavior at home with the family. Second, oftentimes, families might be unaware of what are the interventions or strategies that are being used with their child. So quite literally, children go to school and the doors close behind them, right? And when they close, they lock out the families from knowing what's happening behind those doors. What are the practices that have been effective with their child and what are the practices that may have been less effective? And so if they don't know what the interventions are, they can't support those interventions at home. So we want to open those doors and make sure that families have access to the information and resources to be able to continue the use of those strategies in different environments. And then in some cases, families might be using practices at home or in their community that conflict with the strategies or interventions that are being implemented at school. So for example, if the school is working to decrease a child's challenging behavior, maybe they teach the child that instead of challenging behavior, touch this card to get your wants and needs met. And when you touch the card, we'll give you what you ask for. And when you have challenging behavior, we're going to withhold what it is that you're asking for. Families might not have those strategies, and so they might be giving the child what they're wanting through challenging behavior. So the two interventions conflict with one another, and then progress isn't made. So this all points to the need to support and partner with caregivers and families to promote positive outcomes for the child and for the family across multiple environments. And one way to think about this is through the lens of family systems theory. So family systems theory is this idea that families are all interconnected within a system. And so what happens to one person in the family actually influences and impacts everybody else in the family as well. So you can think of it as sort of like a drop of water in a pond. And while the drop of water might hit a specific spot in the pond, eventually that ripple around that water drop is going to get bigger and bigger until it reaches all of the edges of the pond. And so that's what happens with family systems theory. So when a child is having challenging behavior or not sleeping at night, that's going to impact the whole family. When one of the caregivers is having a lot of stress, that also is going to be felt and impacted with the whole family. And so if we really want to promote positive outcomes for children, we have to be thinking about the systems of their families and other networks in which they are living. So let's talk a little bit about how to build partnerships with families. And I think this lays the foundation for caregiver and mediated interventions. So we'll talk about partnership building, and then we'll talk about some strategies to help support caregivers to implement interventions. And so I want to begin by just thinking about this idea of meaningful collaboration. And meaningful collaboration is less about getting families on board and more about designing interventions that feel familiar, respectful, and achievable within the family's values and goals and resources. So we're not just going to onboard the family to our way of thinking, but we're really going to come together to identify what are the family's strengths. And we can do that, for example, in your first intake meeting with the families. You could ask open-ended questions like, what strategies have worked well with your child in the past? Or you can acknowledge their expertise, like you are the expert on your child. So tell us what helps them calm down, or what are their favorite preferences or things that we might be able to infuse into some of the lessons that we're teaching. Also thinking about strengths within the family's routines. So maybe they have cultural traditions or routine practices that they engage in every day that you could leverage to be able to teach social interaction, communication, problem solving, motor skills, all sorts of things. And then using those strengths also in planning. So if the family, if storytelling, for example, is really important to the family, then you could think about how to build in some narratives to the child's communication plan. So maybe we use social stories because storytelling is something that the family feels really strongly about. Another thing that providers can do is empower families with accessible information. And so sometimes we link all of these great websites, which can be overwhelming and daunting and written in a way that is not really easily understood by people who haven't gone to school for that topic. And so finding plain language resources that are simple and short, maybe short videos, those can be really helpful and more accessible to families. Step-by-step guides can also be really helpful. So maybe like a one-pager of how to use a visual schedule with the child. Those are ways to help make information accessible to families. Sharing community resources is also something that can empower families. So maybe there's support groups or respite services or funding opportunities that the family might want to pursue. And then finally, encouraging families to observe or even participate in some of the routines that are happening in therapy or happening at school so that they can understand, see, practice, and then replicate those strategies at home. Another way that we can create partnerships with families is by compromising. And so this means that, if a family, for example, prefers minimal homework due to their work schedules, we can collaborate with families to take homeworks and then make them shorter or more manageable, or infuse them into routines so that they're not adding one more thing to the family's life, but instead they're being infused into what's already happening in the family's life. Thinking also about compromise in terms of how to communicate. So maybe you really like to communicate with long, detailed emails, and families really prefer, a WhatsApp, a short text, or a quick update and check-in. And so thinking about how to compromise around sharing information that, again, is accessible to families and aligns with their preferences. And in some cases, families' cultural beliefs or their own values might affect the intervention choices that they're willing to learn about or implement with their child. And when that's the case, providers can find alternative strategies that meet the same goal while honoring the family's values. So, for example, if a family says that they're uncomfortable with an intervention that uses physical prompting or hand over hand guidance because they feel it undermines their child's autonomy or dignity, instead of forcing physical prompting, the educator might be able to think about alternative ways that the families could support the child's use of the new skill without physical prompting. So maybe visual supports like picture icons or video modeling, where there's short videos that show what the behavior looks like. Maybe instead of physical prompting, the family's using gestural prompting, like pointing or modeling what it is the child is supposed to do. So there's other ways that we can get to the end goal of teaching the child the behavior in a way that aligns with the family's preferences and values. And so that can be compromising as well. A fourth area is for providers and teachers to think about our own areas of bias, and just notice when we're having thoughts like, I assume that this family is uninvolved because they're not coming to school events. And so is that really a fair assumption? And what's actually happening within the family that is causing them to either not be able to attend or to choose not to attend some school events? We can also be aware of our own biases by just noticing some patterns, such as, making sure that we're speaking to families in a respectful way if English is not their first language, seeking feedback from colleagues or mentors about our communication style and how we might want to ensure that we have respectful communication with people with different styles or backgrounds. And then taking some time at the end of meetings or interactions with families to just do some self-reflection of, did I truly listen to what the family was saying, or did I push my own agenda? Again, we can start to read and study about practices that support families from a variety of backgrounds. So thinking about articles or books or short professional learning modules like these community chats, about culturally responsive family engagement can be really helpful. Thinking about how different cultures might view disability and where it comes from and what it means and who should support or engage with the person with the disability. Thinking about different views around communication, around schooling, around the role of parents and caregivers in their child's education. Some parents may not want to be the interventionist or may not feel comfortable in that role. And so if that's the case, then caregiver mediated intervention might be really challenging for them. And then continuing to think about family-centered practices, and thinking about the family as a connected system and supporting all aspects of that system, which may mean bringing in people with different expertise to support different needs that the family is having. And then finally, we can plan ways to find out more about the community. So maybe visiting local community centers where the family lives or local libraries, touring after school programs in the area, or other family focused events that help us get a better sense of what families' experiences are in the different communities in which we're working. We can also ask families about their own community leaders or faith-based organizations or groups that are important to them, and then think about how to leverage some of those systems of support to help improve the family's information of practices, use of practices, and support of their child's development. We can also do what's called a community scan, which is just looking to see what are the different languages that are spoken in this community, what transportation challenges or systems are there or barriers to transportation, and what supports are available in the community. So all of this work is really behind the scenes kind of background work. It sets the stage for building a partnership with families. And so those are like beginning steps to engage in before we even start to talk to families about how to support their child's development. When we're thinking about collaborating with families of children with disabilities, there's some specific things that we can do in addition to those setting the stage practices that I just talked about. One is helping families find programs to help them learn how to advocate for themselves and for their child, helping families identify resources in their own community, having frequent communication with families in a way that's accessible and meaningful for them so that it's not just once a year at the IEP meeting or the annual education meeting, but it's more frequent communication. Having patience with families because this is challenging work. And while we are providers and we get a paycheck, and when we're done with our day job, we can go home and decompress or go for a walk or meet a friend for dinner. You know, families are in this for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the duration. And so having patience and understanding and supporting families is really key. And then, of course, sharing strategies. So if you find something that's been very effective with the child, you can share that with the family and see what they think about potentially using some of those strategies at home or in their communities. So all of this kind of sets the stage for supporting families to use specific practices, and that's called caregiver-mediated intervention. And that means that at least one primary caregiver, and when we say caregiver, we mean someone who is responsible for supporting and caring for the child. So that could be a parent, that could be a grandparent, perhaps it's a neighbor, an aunt or an uncle or another relative. So caregiver doesn't have to be the parent. It is just someone who has an active role in supporting the child. And so in caregiver mediated intervention, that person is taught to implement interventions with the child. So essentially, they're taught to become an interventionist. Caregiver mediated intervention is cost effective because we're helping to leverage resources or personnel which are already in the child's environment and don't require additional payment for services. It is non-intensive, so caregiver-mediated intervention is not designed to replace services that are provided by professionals in school or therapy situations. It is instead intended to be a non-intensive, low dose, which means short, brief segments of intervention to help keep the learning going or support the transfer of learning across environments. And we know that with caregiver-mediated intervention, we can improve child outcomes because now they're getting access to intervention in other environments. And the more environments where they're learning skills, the more likely they're going to be able to use those skills across those environments. And we know that child outcomes improve when caregivers are taught to implement caregiver-mediated interventions. So in caregiver-mediated intervention, caregivers can be taught one of two things or in combination. One is they could be taught what's called a focused intervention practice. So maybe again, going back to this example of the child where we're trying to decrease challenging behavior and increase communication, maybe we're using a card touch. So when the child wants something like more time on the tablet, they touch the icon of a picture of the tablet. And when they touch that icon, they get access to the tablet. And when they engage in challenging behavior, we don't give them access to the tablet, and instead we remind them how to touch the card so that we can give them access. That's a very focused practice. And so we could teach caregivers to implement that very focused practice. So all of our support is just around that one strategy. Alternatively, we might be able to support caregivers for lots of different, more comprehensive interventions that have lots of moving parts. So maybe we're thinking about strategies to improve language more broadly. And so we're teaching a host of ways that the family might be able to support their child's language or increase their child's social interaction or reduce their child's challenging behavior. So we can teach comprehensive approaches or we can teach really focused intervention practices. A lot of the work that our team has done on caregiver-mediated intervention has focused on intervention practices in a sequential format. So like one at a time. And once one practice is mastered, then we teach the next practice and so forth. Other teams have focused more on these comprehensive multi-component interventions where they're teaching lots of different ways to think about and support the child's development. So if you decide that caregiver mediated intervention is something that you and the family want to pursue, these are some questions to ask. So first, what? What does the caregiver want to accomplish? Why do they want to engage in caregiver mediated intervention? What are their goals? Maybe their goals are to increase appropriate mealtime behavior, or maybe their goals are to be able to take the child out into the community without a tantrum or a meltdown. Or maybe they just want to feel more confident that they can support their child's communication or daily living skills. So beginning with what the caregivers or the family wants to accomplish is our starting point. Once we know what their goals are, then we can talk about when and where that caregiver will implement the intervention. So if they're working on bedtime routines, it would make sense that they'll implement the intervention at bedtime. If they're working on community inclusion, maybe that's something that they're due on the weekends with family outings. So what do they want to accomplish? When do they want to use those strategies to accomplish those goals? And then there's lots of how questions. And this is really where a lot of the planning comes in. So how frequently can they or should they implement the intervention? If it's a very difficult skill that takes a lot of practice to learn, it might be important that they're implementing it very frequently. Versus if it's a skill that only comes up in very rare opportunities, and that might be a less frequent practice of the skill. How will the parent or the caregiver understand what they have learned and communicate what they've learned or evaluate what they've learned? How will the caregiver track their child's progress? Because that's the real reinforcer or reward, right? Is that we're seeing the child make gains. And so how do we teach caregivers to notice those gains and note them? And then how can caregivers help their child generalize the skills or use the skills with different people or in different contexts or different environments? So all of this happens before we even start teaching strategies for the families to implement. We want to think about what they're going to hope to accomplish, when they're going to use those intervention practices, and how they're going to use those intervention practices. Once we know what it is that once we've answered those questions and we know what our focus is for our intervention, the next step is to think about how to actually teach those skills to the caregivers. And we know that training is important, and training can take a lot of different forms, but the real secret ingredient is training plus coaching and ongoing support and feedback. So parent workshops are really helpful for getting the conversation started or sharing knowledge. But if we want families to use those practices after the workshop, they really need to have access to coaching, ongoing support, and feedback. When we're thinking about training, we can think about having whole group trainings where maybe we're bringing lots of families together who might have a shared interest in a certain topic or intervention or child outcome. Or maybe we're thinking about individual trainings where we're working just with one family or one caregiver at a time. And when you're thinking about training models, you want to also think about your capacity. And so maybe you wish you could do individual trainings, but it's not feasible. And so a group training makes more sense. Maybe the family's need is so unique that an individual training is really the way to go. So there's no right or wrong way to think about these trainings. You just want to think about what is going to meet the needs of the families with the resources that you have. And then we can host trainings in a variety of settings as well. So we could actually go to the family's home and with a home visit and support the families to use the practices there. Maybe we invite families into the school and model and support them in using the interventions that we've been using at school. Or maybe we're going with the family into the community to practice the skills in the settings in which they want their child to use those skills. If we're thinking about group training, it can be really helpful to have what we call a manualized program. That means it's scripted, it's structured, and we can replicate it with different groups of families without having to redesign it every single time. And when we're doing group training, again, we want to make sure that there are opportunities for the families to take the strategies that they're learning about and implement them in the home or prepare to implement them in the home. And then to have some time for reflection. So how would this strategy look in my environment? Or how might I adapt that intervention practice to be able to fit the resources that I have in my home? So having some time to individualize the content or have families think about how that might apply to them is a really effective practice within group trainings. Another way that we can help support families is through training through telehealth. And so we used to have to define what telehealth is, and now I think it's pretty commonplace in the US, where we're using some sort of an electronic or digital platform to be able to send information without being in the same space as the family. And so we've seen a lot of an increase in telehealth within educational, medical, and other fields over the last 6 years. And a lot of the research focuses on using telehealth to support focused intervention practices for families, as well as supporting teachers to use evidence-based practices. So we can use group training, individual training, in-person, telehealth, online modules, lots of ways that we might be able to support sharing information with families. One of the most effective ways of teaching adults new skills is called behavioral skills training. And this can be used with families. And behavioral skills training is just these 4 practices. It's written and verbal instruction, like what I'm doing right now. It's modeling, so showing or demonstrating to the family what the intervention looks like. And those models could be videos or live role plays or photos or pictures. So we have written and verbal instruction. We have modeling so that folks can see what this intervention looks like. And then role play where they can practice using the intervention and receive feedback. So they're practicing it, and after they practice, they're able to get feedback on their performance or their use of the strategy. So that's behavioral skills training, and we use these practices all the time. And maybe we use pieces of these practices all the time. And so behavioral skills training is really putting them together into a package. So if you're designing a training for caregivers or teachers or paraprofessionals or any adults, these are really critical elements to make sure are present in your training. When thinking about the written and verbal information, again, we want it to be accessible to families. So sometimes that's not a whole giant book. Sometimes it's a 1-pager with visuals and step-by-step instructions in very simple short phrases. Other times, maybe it's a whole workbook or manual that you're going through little by little over a series of different trainings. So there's no right or wrong way to have written and verbal instruction as long as it's something that the family can go back to and refer to later. When we think about modeling, the second component of behavioral skills training, we might use video models. So maybe there's a video online that we can find and show the family of what this practice looks like. Maybe you create your own video library of using these strategies with the child that you can then show the family. This is what we're doing at school, and this is what it looks like. How might we be able to do this at home with your child or in the community? If you don't have videos, you can also just do live demonstrations with role play. And that also serves as a model. We're just taking these abstract concepts and making them more concrete. That's what the model is designed to do. And even better yet, maybe you bring in the child and model the intervention with the child for the family. The practice piece, the role play piece, is also really essential. So this is a safe space where the stakes are low. There's very limited consequences if the family makes a mistake implementing an intervention. And so a role play takes some of that pressure off. So we're not actually using the strategy with the child yet. We're using the strategy in a safe, mocked up environment. And so role play, maybe you practice the skill, and then afterwards, we might switch roles. So maybe I'll say, okay, caregiver, you be the child, I'll be the teacher. And then we'll talk about what that looked like. And then we're going to switch. Now I'll be the child and you'll be the teacher. And when we're talking about how things went, that feedback piece, we want to make sure that we're providing 2 types of feedback. One is supportive feedback. So this is helping the family know exactly what it was that they did correctly. And maybe it's an approximation. So maybe they weren't actually able to implement the intervention correctly, but they got closer to implementing it correctly, or they made a really good attempt, right? So our supportive feedback can be on effort, or it can be on performance, or a combination of both. But we want to make sure that families are being given praise and behavior specific praise for the efforts that they're making. The other type of feedback that we want to provide is constructive feedback. And so that is not a critique, but it's guidance on how to improve. So it's this growth focused feedback. So what to do differently or how to enhance further something that they're already doing pretty well. So the feedback should have both of those pieces, supportive feedback and constructive feedback. It can also be really helpful to help the caregiver provide themselves with their own feedback. That is kind of getting into this world of self-management and self-learning. So what do you think went well with that role play? What do you think you could improve on next time? And as I said, the real, I think, secret ingredient to driving the uptake of practices that we're teaching families is this ongoing support and feedback. And oftentimes that works best within a framework of coaching. And so there's lots of different models for coaching. I'm going to share a model that we've used for the last several years. But broadly speaking, coaching involves working with the family to set goals for themselves, building plans to help them achieve those goals. Those are called action plans. Creating opportunities for the family to practice those actions or practice the skills that they're hoping to learn. Observing the family's use of the practices or the intervention, giving them feedback, and supporting their own self-reflection. So things that we've already been talking about, but we're doing this in an ongoing effort, not just a one-time role play. So as I said, there are many different coaching models. This is a model that we've been using for many years and is well researched, and it's called practice-based coaching. We use the Anita Zucker model with the University of Florida, developed by these amazing authors. And practice-based coaching is a cyclical process, which means it just keeps occurring over and over. And it's a cyclical process for helping improve the use of specific practices or interventions with the child. So perhaps our center here, that effective teaching practices, is whatever it is we want or the caregiver wants to be implementing with their child. It's that intervention that we're trying to support them in learning. And so that becomes the focus of all of our coaching. We're only going to coach and support around that practice. And that keeps us focused instead of kind of chasing lots of different topics that might come up. So the very center of the wheel are these effective teaching practices. That's the what, like what are we trying to teach? And all of this is housed within this collaborative coaching partnership, which means that families and providers are working together to achieve a common goal. It is non-hierarchical, so it's not an expert and a novice. Instead, it's this equitable model of supporting families to be able to use the skills that are important to them. And then inside the wheel, you see shared goals and action planning, focused observation and reflection and feedback. So the shared goals and action planning, that's what kicks off our cycle. So what is it that's important to the family to learn or to use, or what is their goal around this specific teaching practice? And what are they going to do to help support their use of that specific practice? Focused observation is that observation of their use of the practice. And it's focused because we're only going to focus on the practice that we're talking about here. So maybe I see all these other things that families could work on. I'm not going to overwhelm them with all these other areas. We're just going to focus on the practice that was important to them. And then we come together for joint reflection and feedback. So the family is engaged in, or the family member is engaged in self-reflection, and the coach is there as a facilitator and a guide, but not as an evaluator. And this also helps make sure that that's an equitable partnership and reduces that power differential. So when we've worked with families with a practice-based coaching approach, we often have goal planning forms and action planning forms. And these are more comprehensive. We have very short versions, again, to help match the needs of the family. But the family starts with thinking about something that is a strength for them related to this practice, something that is a challenge, what their priority is, and they use all of that to design their goal. And then the coach is there to support the family in making progress towards their goal. Once there's a goal, then we can start to plan for how are we going to achieve it. And in planning, we're going to do some preemptive problem solving. So what challenges or barriers might come up? And how can we note those in advance and then come up with strategies to help reduce those barriers ahead of time so that we don't end up kind of pausing or giving up because we ran into a roadblock. We're going to identify the roadblocks and create a map for how to get around them or through them. Maybe families need materials. So if we're teaching that card touch, the family's going to need some cards or some pictures or an instruction on how to use different modes of communication with their child. So sometimes coaching also involves helping families secure materials or providing families with the materials they need. What other resources might they need to help them achieve that goal? Maybe they need somebody to help take care of the baby so that they can practice these strategies with their child. And then how will they maintain their motivation to keep going? And so again, the motivation here is their child's progress. And so by them mastering or making progress towards their goal, how is that going to help their child? And that can be sort of the North Star when things get frustrating or challenging to keep families focused on how they can continue to persevere in the face of these challenges to help their child. And part of that might be asking for more resources or more information to be able to achieve those outcomes. So goal setting and action planning are the first part of that wheel within practice-based coaching, and that sort of sets the stage for the practice, the observations, and the feedback. When we're using practice-based coaching or any coaching model, we want to think about meeting families where they are. So we designed a study a few years ago where we used an online coaching platform to be able to support families during home routines to help their child learn communication skills. And so one thing we did was we added video self-reflection. So we asked families to record themselves implementing the strategies because we couldn't go out to all the homes. So the families record themselves and then they watch their own videos and provide themselves with that supportive and constructive feedback. So again, helping them take control and ownership of their own learning. We also had families send us videos and then we could tag at moments in the video to provide feedback. So we might say, oh, right here, and click on that segment in the video, look at how you, in this case, helped her add a little more to her play and look how she responded. Or over here, look at how you use the iPad. And this time she started to engage with it. So we can tag feedback to videos and then families know exactly what to do. And that serves as another model for them. We also created an exemplar library with lots of videos of families using the strategies that we were helping this family to use. And so that way they have their own library that they can go back to and see as many models as they need to be able to understand the strategy. And I showed you that really long goal setting and action planning form, and some families don't have time for that business. And so here's their goal planning and action planning form. Here's their goal, and here's one action step they're going to take that week. So thinking about how to make the model accessible to families and what adaptations need to be made is really helpful for meeting families where they are. We also know that when families are involved in planning the intervention strategies that they're going to use with their child, they're more likely to implement that intervention at home because the goals of the intervention align with the goals for their child. So it can be more feasible and there's more alignment, and so they're going to stick with it longer. We can also support motivation for families by helping the families set goals for using the practice at home in between our coaching or feedback sessions. And then again, problem solving. So anticipating some of those challenges and creating solutions before the challenges take place so that they don't end up disrupting the family in terms of making continued progress. So I'm just going to highlight briefly a study that we did a few years ago with helping families use an intervention to decrease challenging behavior and increase appropriate communication with their child. And we did this all through telehealth using practice-based coaching, as I just described to you. And so these were caregivers of children who had recently been diagnosed with autism or another developmental disability. And we worked with caregiver and child dyads. So that means one caregiver and one child. And we did a research study that had 3 phases. The first phase was baseline. So that's before we implemented any caregiver mediated intervention training. We just wanted to see, how are caregivers interacting with their child now around communication and challenging behavior. Then we designed online modules that were asynchronous. So the families could log on, watch the module, which was based on behavioral skills training, written and verbal instruction, modeling, an opportunity for them to role play and then get feedback. And then we helped them to fade out the intervention so that it was more feasible in the long run. So we worked with 3 families, so 3 mothers and their child, and you can see a breakdown of the families here. And this was the content for the online module. So 1 week focused on behavior as communication. The second week focused on visual activity schedules and choice making. The third week focused on an intervention called functional communication training. And the fourth week focused on an intervention called differential reinforcement, where we give more reinforcement for behaviors we want to see and less reinforcement for behaviors that the family doesn't want to see. And so we checked in with the families weekly, even before we started doing the intervention, just to see how they were doing, making sure that they understood the expectations and that they were recording themselves engaged with their child. And then we started the caregiver mediated intervention training. And so this was once a week online. The caregivers watched a video and then they met with a coach. And these are the procedures for what that coaching session looked like. So the caregivers started by giving updates and celebrations, as well as priorities for what was happening with their child. The caregiver reflected on how the last week had gone in terms of that intervention. They outlined what their objectives were for this meeting so that it could stay focused and tightly organized. They discussed strategies that were and weren't working with their child. And then the coach provided supportive feedback. So again, telling them what they've been doing well, and constructive feedback, helping them think of ways to improve or enhance the practices that they're using. They talked about more opportunities that they could create in the home to be able to practice these skills. There were examples. The caregivers could ask questions. Resources were shared if that was needed. And then they reviewed action steps and set the date for the next coaching session. So this is a templated script that you as providers are welcome to use in your own coaching sessions with families. These are the results of the studies. So these are on the left are our mothers, and on the right are their child or their children. On the horizontal axis or the x-axis, that's sessions. So that's the different observation videos that the families submitted. And on the vertical axis, that's the percentage of steps that the mothers implemented correctly of the intervention that they were learning. And so you can see in baseline, I think you can see this maybe, in baseline, the family or the mothers had pretty low levels of implementation. So this goes all the way up to 100, which would be great to see. And instead, you can see this mother was really at 0% and then about 15% of the steps implemented, which makes sense, right? We hadn't taught her how to do this yet. You can see for this mother, she hovered around 40% correct. And this mother hovered close to 0 for most of the sessions, except for a few that bumped up to around 30%. This dotted line means that that's when we started the caregiver mediated intervention training. And what we see is that for all 3 moms, as soon as we started this training, their use of the practices improved. And so we have a really nice, steady, slow and steady increase for this mother where she started using the practices more and more correctly. Betty had an immediate change where she started using the practices more accurately, and she continued to improve over time. And same with Caroline, an immediate improvement and then steady growth over time. That steady growth shows you the importance of the ongoing support and feedback. If we had done a one-time training then that very first data point would have been as high as that families could get. And we saw that with ongoing support and feedback, they were able to grow even more. And then we can see for their child's challenging behavior, which are the open triangles. Challenging behavior is high in baseline when the families hadn't been taught the strategies. And when the mothers start using the strategies with their child, challenging behavior decreases. So for this little guy, it got down to 0. For this little guy, he bumped up a little bit at the beginning, and then he also had no more challenging behavior. It took Asher a little longer to learn the new skill, but once he got it, he rocked it. And he also stayed low, except for one little time when he tried the old way one more time, and then he went back to no challenging behavior. And the circles are their use of appropriate communication. And so you can see we've got low levels of communication in baseline. And then once the mothers were taught these strategies, look at what happened to these kids' communication skills. They all improved, with Cade being like picture perfect poster child, where he had no appropriate communication until his mom started using the strategies. And then he was at 100%. Really awesome work. And all of this was through supporting families to be able to implement these strategies with their child. So in general, we want to think about taking supports and contextualizing them so that they fit the needs and values and goals of the families that we're serving. So asking, what are the caregivers' preferences and priorities? What do they want to work on? What type of feedback is appropriate? Do they value? Do they want written feedback? They want you to talk through it with them. What type of intervention is appropriate and meaningful for them, given the environment in which they live and the needs of their child? So understanding the lives of families is critical. Family systems theory teaches us that families are interconnected systems and that we can't just intervene on the child or support the child. We really have to be supporting the entire family. So what can we do as providers? We can gain insight into the home context. We can develop cultural competence about that family's values, culture, backgrounds, resources, and community. We can be sensitive to the lives and challenges that families face, which might be different from our lives and the challenges that we face. We can create partnerships with families by offering a variety of ways for families to participate in their child's development, one of which might be caregiver-mediated intervention. And we can always ensure that we're respecting families' priorities and concerns and compromising to find ways to blend evidence-based practices with the priorities that the families have. And with that, that is the end of what I have prepared here. So thank you so much for inviting me.
That was so helpful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I have one question, and then if anybody else has questions, we have a few minutes left, if you don't mind hanging out with us for just a few more minutes.
Sure.
So one of the questions you mentioned, the benefits of providing resources in a really strategic way, right? In a way that is considerate and thoughtful of what the families would potentially benefit from. Do you have suggestions for either creating structures within a classroom setting, for example, or within a practice so that that becomes more of a ritual or a part of your communication with those families so that you can set up that structure ahead of time?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And something when I was a teacher, I wish I had done is to create that routine and that ritual, because then it becomes habit. And then we are able to implement those supports more frequently. Yeah, I think meeting with families to understand what their preferred mode of communication is and what their priorities are is really a starting point. Because a one size fits all, we know in special education that that's not the way things work. And so we might start with a model or a routine as a broad structure, but then be able to individualize for different families within it. So maybe every Wednesday I check in with, the one half of my families, and every Friday I check in with the other half. And what those check-ins look like might differ. Or maybe, with all these great apps that we can share videos and photos, maybe I can send short clips of their child doing really great things at school. that maybe we couldn't have done before. So again, just trying to like open those doors between the school world or the therapy world and the child's life outside of those walls. And so I think finding short ways to communicate and building that into your weekly routine is really helpful.
Yeah, it's a great point. So that leads to a quick follow-up. I saw the exemplar videos that you had looked amazing and such a great idea to personalize for families. Is there a particular software that you all use or an app that teachers or other caregivers could use, or is that something that you all have built for your lab?
No, so the image or the screenshots that I shared with you was from a platform that's called Torsh,
Yeah.
um, Torsh. And we've worked with them for a number of years. They have an online practice-based coaching platform that was designed for early childhood providers. And then we adapted it with them to be able to make it accessible for families. So we just simplified it. It comes with an app that's really easy for families to use because sometimes internet access is spotty. And so it takes forever for a video to buffer or upload. And so we found that app to be really helpful. There's a variety of other apps that might be available to families too that might be more affordable or feasible or accessible. You also don't have to have a fancy app. You could just have, photo sharing services turned on and keep it really low cost. The video library, we were able to accumulate these videos over years. And I think that's something that making sure that families give permission, but if families can help build those libraries for other families, I think that's so helpful. We've done a lot of work with children with rare genetic syndromes. And one of the things the families say is we never see our kids represented in these videos. And so we empowered the families to be able to build those videos for their own community. And so I think building up your own video library can be helpful. There are, existing videos online that are of varying quality that you could also find, but more and more, I think there's just a lot you could sort through that already exists that would be low cost.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like you said, it is a great way to build community for families who often are looking to do just that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And also, are these training modules are still accessible, available
That's a
currently?
super question. We should make them accessible and available. They were part of a research study. And
Right.
so when the study concluded,
Mm-hmm.
the modules stopped being open. But I think in the name of open science and helping give resources to families, like that's an action item for me is to find ways to get these out there for all families.
Right. I think it's gonna be so beneficial. Um, and also when how you individualize the caregiver training. I know now you have the online module for them weekly to learn. And then do you create like individual treatment plan for each family or like how that process look like?
Yeah. So the families set their own intervention plan. So they decided what they wanted to work on. So we
Uh-huh.
said, we're going to work on choice making, for
Okay.
example. And the family says, well, I want to work on giving picture choices at, I don't know, mealtime so that they
Mm-hmm.
can help choose what they want to eat or what they want to
Okay.
wear, right? Or maybe another family was like, well, I just want to do like verbal choices of you
Mm-hmm.
can do this or you can do that. And so, or I'm really good at using choices. I just want to use it more often. So maybe it's
Yeah.
like the frequency or quantity of a practice. So families drove all of that. And we were just there. The coach is really there as like a facilitator and
Mm-hmm.
support, but not as like a here's what you're going to do next, right? So we want to like
Right.
get rid of that power differential and really just support families to work on what's important to them.
Mm-hmm. Then do you have a like a set time for them to take the video and send the video for you to analyze?
We
Or it
did. We gave
changes?
them, yeah, we gave them 1 week to turn it in, and then we could give them feedback. And
Uh-huh.
that was a really helpful eye opener for us
Uh-huh.
because we thought, oh, well, this is like a 5 minute video, no big deal.
Uh-huh.
And that was a real barrier for many families, finding 5 minutes to set
Mhm.
up a camera and get the child and And so some weeks it was really challenging for
Yeah.
families to get those videos in. And so I think thinking if that's a challenge that families have, then we need to brainstorm a different path for them.
Right.
Yeah,
Because I do know sometimes when I pull out my camera, try to do things, and then it doesn't go as a plan,
yeah,
or there's the intervention went so well and then you didn't capture it.
that's right. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
And
all those things.
Yeah.
right. And how did you do the caregiver preference assessment? Do you have an interview at the beginning or like,
Yeah, we did an intake interview with each family and
okay.
asked them kind of what their priorities are,
Mm-hmm.
learned about them, learned about their child, and learned about, like all those things about like their values, their resources, and their goals.
That sounds so cool.
Afi,
And
Yeah.
I would, oh, sorry.
Okay.
nope, I was just going to ask if
Sorry.
you had any questions or anything you wanted to add while you were here.
Oh, I was gonna say I would assume, the analysis would take a long time because you may have a parent whose English is not a first language of theirs, or that diversity would take a while to analyze and for them to really understand what they have to do. So that would definitely take time.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And so that's something to think about is if that's going to be a barrier that prevents them from participating, then we
Mhm.
want to remove that barrier. And so think about other ways that they might be able to get feedback.
Right. And also, like, is there any framework you use to guide you through the culturally responsive piece? Or,
Yeah,
oh,
we should do another community chat on that. But I'll just say we use the ecological validity framework or
that's what I did.
ESV or EVF. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has 8 domains for cultural adaptation. It's very
Mhm.
behavioral, which I like because sometimes I think about cultural adaptation and it just seems so big and abstract. I
Yeah.
don't know what to do. And I think the ecological validity framework is really like very action oriented. And so that's how we've done our adaptations.
Oh, yeah. That sounds so, that's what I also use for my dissertation, guide me
Amazing.
through. Yeah.
That's so
Right.
great and gives us a wonderful idea for a future community chat. So thank
Yes.
you.
There you go.
Yes.
Okay, well, I am going to stop the recording now.